Good evening. All right, tonight we move along in our study of the life of Christ, and for a number of weeks we've been looking at the events following Jesus' arrest by the mob, and as he was would endure the Jewish trial, and tonight we move forward now to the Roman trial of Jesus. And tonight we want to consider now as Jesus goes before Pilate. Now, the events we look at this evening are recorded by all four of the gospel accounts. Matthew records this in chapter 27, verses 11 through 13. Mark records it in chapter 15, verses 2 through 14. Luke records it in chapter 23, verses 24 and 25, and John in chapter 18, verses 28 through 40. Now, for our purposes, we're mainly going to focus around Mark's account this evening. And as always, we kind of bounce back and forth between them, especially in when we come to those that's recorded by multiple writers. And I think that's good because it helps us to see the harmony and what all of the writers would present. So let's go to Mark chapter 15, and actually I will pick up in verse 1. Immediately in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you." But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now at the feast, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whoever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd so that he should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them again, "What then do you want me to do with him who you call the king of the Jews?" So they cried out again, "Crucify him." Then Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. And so we see the beginnings now of Jesus before the Romans. Now, again, here in Mark chapter 15 this evening, let's go back to verse 2. As he first appears before Pilate. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." So he questions Jesus. Now it's interesting. Now the Jews are outside. They would not enter the judgment hall. Do you know why they would not enter the judgment hall?
It was Passover.
It would defile them, and then they wouldn't be able to observe the various ceremonies, that they would do at any time, including the Passover, as Sue mentioned. isn't it, they were so concerned, isn't it that interesting that they would not go into the hall, but yet they're happy and have no qualms about condemning an innocent man to death. But we can't go in there and defile ourselves. Well, what do you think the murder of Jesus was going to do to them? Now, also we got to think here. Now think back to the Jewish trial. What was the difficulty they had in condemning Jesus? They had trouble.
Couldn't find fault.
They couldn't find fault in him. They couldn't get eyewitnesses that would stack up against him without falling apart. And so when they sent him to Jesus, they had condemned him all right, convicted him, but what were they lacking? Good reason. They didn't have evidence. And so, do they really want Pilate to ask them too many questions? No, they just want Pilate to know that what? This fellow's the worst thing you've ever seen. You got to get rid of him now before anything worse happens. That's their mindset. But they certainly do not want to be, really given very detailed questions by Pilate about things. So this is taking place now. Pilate talks to them, and if you're Pilate now, what do you think's going through the mind of Pilate right now?
What are these guys up to?
Yeah, what are they up to? This doesn't make any sense. I don't see anything wrong with it. Well, what are they trying to do here? And so in essence, he's puzzled by all of it, isn't it? He don't know what to make of it. Now, John in his account, if you go to John chapter 18 and verse 31, now notice what Pilate says to them. Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So what's Pilate trying to do here?
Put it back on them.
He wants to put it back on them. And then that next statement, therefore the Jews said, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Well, what has Pilate just given them permission to do? To put him to death. But they don't want to do it. Why do they not want to do it? Why, if they hate him so bad, why do they not want to do it?
It's against their law.
It's pretty questionable. But they're more scared of the people.
The rebellion.
They're more scared of what the people will do, the rebellion that will come because of it. Because remember, what had happened just a few days earlier? How did Jesus enter Jerusalem? Like a king? Triumphantly? What? The people were what? Shouting? Praising? And so, yeah, they just quickly turned, didn't they? Things had quickly turned around here, but, they want Pilate to do their dirty work. And so they reply, to him that he's perverting the nation. He's taking these good people, these good, loyal citizens, and what? He's brainwashing them. He's perverting their minds. He's turning them away. Look in Luke's account. Look at Luke chapter 23. Verses 1 and 2 there. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, is this not the most brazen statement you've ever seen? We found this fellow perverting the nation. And now let's follow that with the lies. And forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. They found this fellow. I think that's an interesting term there. Obviously, it's to them, it's a term of derision or downgrading. Does any of you have does your version say something else there besides this
Mine
fellow?
just says man.
I'm sorry?
My New American Standard just says man.
This man, that New American Standard? So, how did Jesus pervert the nation?
He did.
I'm sorry?
He did.
He didn't, that's right. He did not. But in their minds, he did. So what? If Jesus followed, if he followed the law perfectly, which he did, then what was to them, what really was it he was perverting? Their ways and their traditions. Because he was not perverting the law, was he? He was keeping the law perfectly. But when they had bound their traditions into law in their own mind, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it? And so that's what we get there. Now, they said that they said he was forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, what did Jesus teach about taxes?
Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
You give Caesar what's Caesar's and God what's God's. Jesse?
Just going back to what you were saying, that he was perverting more their tradition and their ways that they were stuck in. Think about the first few chapters in the book of Romans. That's what it's dealing with their tradition that was fulfilled. That's not what mattered anymore, but they couldn't get out of it. They were stuck in it. And I think that's just a very big theme seen really in the Old Testament.
All right. And don't misunderstand me now. I like tradition. But sometimes we can be almost as bad as those Pharisees were in regards to some of our traditions. We will fight harder to keep our traditions than we will the law of Christ. We must be very, very careful to never let those things that are of opinion or of a tradition, whether, even if it's a good thing, never let it become what? Law. It must keep its proper place, and we must be respectful of its proper place. Now, all of these things, you see, again, this is why they don't want to be questioned too closely, because what truth have they spouted out there in Luke 23, 1 and 2? Not much. So we go back to our text now, and in verse 3, we read that the chief priest accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Did you notice there, just like he had before the Jews in the preceding verse there, are you the king of the Jews? And he said, what, you rightly say that I am? Again, remember how we talked about how Jesus did not give those Pharisees exactly what they wanted? He does the same thing with Pilate here. But when he doesn't answer Pilate, remember Pilate, the Jews had this built-in hatred already of Jesus and their animosity toward him. But now Pilate coming in here, does Pilate have any built-in animosities toward Jesus much? No. He may find him a nuisance, but he didn't have all of these ideas about Jesus. And so I would think in Pilate's mind, what would you think? What would you think about Jesus at this point? I think he's somebody that's causing a stir amongst these people that are subordinate to us. Yes, ma'am.
I was gonna say, the reason what Pilate was thinking in his mind was he knew that it was for envy, that the people were trying to do that.
Yes, and that's pointed out. He knew they handed him over because of envy, and so Pilate even tries to work around that in a way, doesn't he? A little bit of psychology there, but we don't want to become too sympathetic towards Pilate, because that's all going to come crashing down soon enough here. But he's really he's astounded by the fact that Jesus is not responding to these charges, because he sees they're false. And if I'm the judge and I got Andrew here in court, and he's been charged with beating up Johnny and beating up Jared and beating up Jesse Lee, but I know that it wasn't him, because I know Brother Jim did it. Well, so I know I'm the judge, and I know that Andrew's innocent. What would I be expecting Andrew to do? Plead his case. But he doesn't say anything. And again, and he's not going to, because, and thanks be to God that he didn't. Because what if he had him?
Jesus wouldn't have died for him, wouldn't have had hope.
Yeah, because he had an appointment with death, and he was going to keep it, and he was going to keep it for me and for you. And so, it's amazing. In verse 4, then Pilate asked him again, saying, do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you. But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. So let's try to put ourselves in the mind of Pilate now for a minute. We are convinced that Jesus has committed no crime. And now, as an important man here, a man who has control over what's going to be done in the earthly sense, the people want him to die, apparently. I can't find anything wrong. What am I going to do? What should he do? He should do justice. I mean, he should release him, right?
Yeah.
He should not be scared of the people. I don't want us to have judges that are scared of the people. I want judges that do what? What is right. Whether it's in the minority or the majority, do right. But at the least, make an attempt to, so I'll get them to change, at a minimum. So Pilate now, the idea, the little light bulb comes on in his head. Well, how can I get out of this situation? It's like, I don't want to kill him, but I'll kill him if I got to save my own neck. But, wait a minute. There's something I heard. Look, let's go back to Luke 23 now again. And this is some things that Mark doesn't record. This is more information here. Luke 23 now, beginning in verse 5. But they were the more fierce, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. Uh-oh. The light comes on in his head. Look at now, go to the next verse. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. So apparently Pilate did not know where Jesus was actually from up to this point. But he deduces this. In verse 7, as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who also was in Jerusalem at that time. Herod just happened to be in Jerusalem. I'll send him to Herod. Herod can take care of this. I'll be off the hook. My job is safe. The Jews won't be mad at me. My authorities in the empire will not be mad at me, and everything will go back to normal, and my wife and I can eat grapes all day long. And that's about, I think, how his mind is working. All right, so again, now Mark doesn't talk about him appearing before Herod. So let's just stay here in Luke now as Jesus goes before Herod. Now Herod also, he's heard about Jesus, and so and we're going to see here that he wanted to talk to Jesus. He was intrigued by him. But what was he wanting out of Jesus?
Miracles.
Yeah, he wanted a show, didn't he? He wanted do some miracles, do some wonders, you know. So verse 8, still there in Luke 23. Now, when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired to see for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, let's hold up right there a minute. So, again, Jesus won't answer anything. Herod here wanting this show, what do you think this is doing to Herod's demeanor as he goes? He starts out excited. He's getting frustrated. He's getting irritated with him. And I think he probably now is beginning to feel, it's beginning to turn to contempt and like he's embarrassing me, you know. Geraldine?
Well, and it's curious to me. I wonder if people, while they're like accusing him of these things and whatnot, that it's obviously probably irritating to all of them that even though they want to discredit him and they want to have a reason, I wonder if they were just getting so almost kind of like in this situation irritated that he's not defending himself at all, even though they also probably were had such relief that he's not speaking and he's not trying to defend himself, but also kind of seeming a little high and mighty, you know. I'm curious how everyone reacted to that.
Yeah, you can be right. You could be right on. I think the Romans. I think they basically. I think they wanted to do justice, but there was one thing that would overrule justice to them. And what was that? Their own neck. You know, if everything was all right, we're going to do the right thing. But you know, if it's going to be dangerous to us, we're going to do what we need to do. And so I see that kind of mindset somewhat. But now let's go on with verse 11. Now as they're, you know, their emotions are building up against Jesus too. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. What will make two people that don't get along with each other friends?
Common enemy.
A common enemy. You know, think back to World War II. You know, the United States and Russia, enemies. But when we had a common enemy, what did we become? You know, we became friends. As soon as the common enemy was gone, what happened? Now we're enemies again. Herod had been pleased to see Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus, and in his mind the show that come along with him. He wanted to see him make the blind see, to heal the lame. But in the end, after questioning him, he treats him with contempt. He mocks him. But in doing that, what was Herod actually doing? Very important.
He was mocking, laughing.
Yeah.
He's playing into God's plan.
He's playing into God's plan. Yeah, all right. And Jesse, man, he was fulfilling prophecy. Things that had to be fulfilled. Let's look back to the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. And, you know, I sometimes we don't give enough attention to the prophets and things, but I know at the Lambs Academy, when I sit through Brother Colley's Isaiah class, over and over and over, pointing out the fulfillment by Jesus of all of these prophecies, how they were all coming to pass. And you know, the greatest proofs we have of the accuracy of the Bible. And so in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3, look how this prophecy is fulfilled here in these events. He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. And so, this treatment here from Herod. Now, if we go, let's go back now to Mark and pick back up in our text now as he's been before Herod, and he'll be sent back to Pilate. And it says, now at the feast, he was accustomed, talking about Pilate here, he was accustomed to releasing one prisoner to them, whomever they requested. And there was one named Barabbas, who was chained with his fellow rebels. They had committed murder in the rebellion. Then the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. But Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" For he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy, as was mentioned earlier. Now, Pilate sees this is another opportunity. This is another way that I can get this to an end without messing everything up. I think I can satisfy the Jews this way, because they're not going to want this Barabbas guy. If anybody ought to be called this fellow, it would be Barabbas, wouldn't it? And so, if I can get them to take Jesus here, this can all be over. Now, let's let's jump back to Luke 23 again. I guess I should have told you to mark Luke 23 earlier. And let's read Luke's account here. Luke 23 now beginning in verse 13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things which you accuse him." And as Jesse said earlier, he should have released him right then. In fact, he should have released him with an accompanying guard to protect him from the Jews. But look what he does. And now, you know, if you were tempted to have any sympathy towards Pilate, this ought to end it. So I found no fault in this man concerning these things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. And indeed, nothing of death has been done by him. He's innocent. So what am I going to do? I will therefore chastise him and release him. Now, you know, it's one thing to say, "Jesse, I'm not going to do anything to you, but don't you do anything else. And you go out and behave now. Don't you even come back before me." Now, you know, that's one thing. He might get mad because I talked to him that way. But you know, I didn't scourge him. What did to chastise mean to scourge him? To scourge him, and we'll talk more about that next week. But one thing I want to point out now, many people, many men had been scourged by the Romans, but Jesus was worse than anyone's. You see, Jesus would not even be recognizable. He would be beaten so to a pulp in his scourging. And again, we'll talk more about that next week. But this was not some punishment. This was not like, "All right, I'm gonna keep you in the county jail for 30 days, and then we'll let you go, just for good measure." No, this was to beat him within an inch of his life. This was to rip apart his skin. This was to expose his internal organs. This was brutal beyond measure. Share with you Brother Burton Kaufman in his commentary here about this. There was nothing mild about the horrible Roman flagellation. In this brutal suggestion, the moral crevices in the character of Pilate were plainly visible. This proposal to subject a man he had just declared to be innocent to the shocking and bloody chastisement practiced in those days showed plainly enough that Pilate actually had no moral scruples against crucifixion, and that proposal was probably the first indication to the Jewish leaders that they were going to be able to have their way with Pilate in regard to Christ. I think Brother Kaufman was probably right here. I think this is where the high priest and the Pharisees probably began to realize that their plan was working, and it looks like it's going to come to the end they desired. You know, but back to Pilate now. You know, in Pilate's mind, by offering Barabbas up to him, he thinks, you know, Barabbas is so evil that they would not want him released back out among them. But that's how stirred up they were, Anthea?
Just over, I guess, the years of reading both of these accounts, I did always get so confused by the mob of like, why would you want this murderous criminal out in front of you? Even, I know people get like mob mentality, but I always thought there had to be some people that were like, I don't want this man roaming the streets, but then I think like how thankful I am in a way that Barabbas was released, because I am Barabbas in a way of like, I am guilty of my crimes. I should be doing my time, but I'm released because Jesus took my place. And I just see the comparison there, like even within this account, how bad it was that he was released, and almost in a way it was wrong. I see the comparison of how I can be in the state of Barabbas and Jesus still taking the place of me on the cross.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, because if we make the spiritual comparison here with ourselves, or may not have done the things that Barabbas did, but still, without Christ, where do you stand? Worthy of what? Death. That's all, that you've earned it. The wages of sin is death. All men have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We stand where there was no reason for Barabbas to be released to that. No logical reason for Barabbas to be set loose. But at the same time, was there any logical reason for Anthea to be released from the bondage of sin? No. But Jesus shed his blood and made it possible. And now we take it back to the physical realm. This fellow, Barabbas, when Jesus went on that cross, very soon, who did Jesus go on that cross for? Barabbas. He was one of the ones he went to that cross for. Think about that. What a gift. Beyond our ability to comprehend. Now, back in verse 10, for he knew that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. You mentioned earlier. Pilate knew the real motive was envy. And Pilate had been smart enough to figure out that they loved their own preeminence and in regard to the Jews, and that he knew that even back from that triumphal entry into Jerusalem, they were greatly angered by the things that were taking place. And then we think back, Anthony, as you told me earlier about how that crowd would get so stirred up. We get to verse 11 now. The chief priest stirred up the crowd so that they should rather release Barabbas to them. Pilate answered and said to them, what then do you want me to do with him who you call the King of the Jews? Now, the scripture here doesn't reveal to us, how they did it, but Brother Bob Winton wrote here, and I think this is the most logical thing I've ever seen on it. Listen to what he said about it. They likely circulated through the crowd, arguing and cajoling them to do so. Perhaps some of them were strategically placed among the people to raise a chant which the multitude joined. When one person laughs, others are moved to laugh with them even if they don't know what's funny. Rabble-rousers are able to manipulate a crowd to do their will. Consider some of the popular things we see today. Some of these protesters today, I know good and well they don't all believe what they're doing. But, somebody stirs them up. I'm going to have to go on this because I got very little time left. The question Pilate faced here is that, it's still the same question we all face today. Pilate's question is, what am I going to do about Jesus? What are you going to do about Jesus? Verse 13, well, what's this stirred up crowd do? They cry out again, crucify him. The mob mentality taking over. Verse 14, then Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, crucify him. And Pilate now pleads a second time to the Jewish mob for the release of Jesus. But the mob only gets further out of control. In Matthew's account in chapter 27 and verse 25, all the people answered and said, his blood be on us and on our children. One of the saddest statements you'll ever read, because it certainly was. What they wished for, they were fixing to get. Another thing I want to read here, this was from Brother Guy N. Woods. The extreme malignancy and spiteful hate which characterized the Jews in their deliberate and calculated efforts to destroy Jesus are without parallel in human history. And the retribution which they brought upon themselves is unequaled in all the annals of mankind. All who participated in this historic miscarriage of justice have felt the retribution reserved for the most wicked of the earth. The infamous Judas died in shame of a suicide. Pilate, whose political fortunes he valued more than justice, stood helplessly by as his prestige fell, ultimately dying in banishment and disgrace. Caiaphas was expelled from the high priesthood. Herod punished in shame and exile. The house of Annas suffered destruction at the hands of a mob, and his own son was dragged through the streets of the city. The siege of Jerusalem, with its unspeakable horrors, became the tragic lot of the race itself, as tens of thousands of Jewish people suffered and died, direct descendants of those who had divisively cried, let his blood be on us and our children. That ought to bring us to tears. Vernon, the French infidel, said of them, it seems as the whole race had appointed a rendezvous for extermination. If ever a rebellious people deserved the fate they did, and yet the blood which they shed in the limitless and unfathomable depths of God's mercy was poured out for them. And among the last words their victim uttered on the cross was a plea for mercy on their behalf, in their behalf. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Love at last had conquered, and the Lord in triumph achieved his purpose in coming to earth. Yeah, their blood was upon them. In verse 15, so Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowd, released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to be crucified. Pilate would demonstrate that he was more concerned about himself than Jesus. And unfortunately, the modern day Pilate is alive and well, even today. Those who say they are against various sins like homosexuality or alcohol or drugs or abortion and the like, and then do nothing to work against it. Even often voting for those who would promote these sins. We need to note that those Jews that claimed they wanted to do right by Caesar desired the release of Barabbas. Barabbas had committed high crimes against Caesar in Rome. And the one they wanted to put to death did nothing against Caesar and in fact promoted good citizenship among his people. And so, as we've noted week after week, this saddest episode in the history of the world was getting worse. And it was only going further downhill until man would reach his ultimate low. Jesus was soon going to be on the cross, and even in spite of all this, would say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The Lord's invitation is open this evening. If you have sin in your life and you're making His death and shedding of His blood and His resurrection in vain, why not fix it now? Why not become a child of God if you never have? There's no better time than right now. If we can help you in any way this evening, let it be known as we stand together and sing.